This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virts, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. If you love the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. Today, we're very lucky. We're talking to the entire opposite end of Earth, all the way down in Australia. Steve James is with us. I'm super excited to have Steve here. Steve is the former Inspector of Police for Victoria, as well as a Ministerial Adviser on drug policy for both the state and federal government in Australia. So Steve, thanks for joining.
G'day, mate, and thanks very much for having me.
Been a while since we've seen each other. You guys got stuck down there in COVID.
We did, and it's the figures are rising again, unfortunately. So we're not done yet.
You know, Australia, I mean, you talk about people in America complain about lockdowns, man. You guys had a lockdown. That surprised me because I figured Australians are a little bit more, you know, you're kind of like the Texans of the Pacific. But you guys you were really kind of stuck at home for.
Oh yeah, my wife was stuck here, unfortunately, with me it was really tough. But for about 18 months, she couldn't leave, and she got cabin fever. So, we get by.
I understand. Meredith's great. Of course, I work with her, and that's we missed her over here in the States, but she was finally able to come back. So you have what I want to talk about today is how Australia's handled guns. And you have a pretty cool background as a law enforcement guy. So can you tell us about that? Like what your career and your story is?
Now, my background is I joined a cadet system, which doesn't exist today, but I joined at 15. And
oh, wow.
I spent 37 years in Victoria Police, which is a state down south of Australia. And I basically followed crime. So from the early days of doing things like right control, search and rescue, and high risk entries, I went into the crime department, and from there I went mainly to the drug area, but I was also trained in explosives, so I went into that area as well, and I worked drugs and organised crime. Later on, I was a police prosecutor and a trainer. And as an inspector, I became the Ministerial Adviser on drugs policy and legislation for Australia and New Zealand for 11 years.
Australia and New Zealand?
Australia and New Zealand. We have a partnership with there, and we travel regularly and advise their minister as well as their police across there. So it was quite a good job. I enjoyed that for 37 years. So I'm old now and I'm retired. So.
Well, so you had you kind of started off as a beat cop, and you ended up kind of at the top, you know, helping make policy there.
Yeah, I don't know if it was at the top. They flattened the structure. I was an acting chief inspector for 5 years, and they flattened the rank. So you go from inspector to superintendent to commissioner. So yeah, I was in the top couple of percent. But
flattening rank, is that code word for not paying you as much as they should have?
I think so. You know, it's when you look at what you do for the pay you get, it's not dissimilar to what the military do, I'd imagine.
Yeah. It's funny. You're actually the second Australian I've had on the podcast. I had John Seal on a few months ago. Ever heard of him?
I know John Seal, yes.
He was incredible. He was so much fun. And I think his stories were very similar to yours in that, I don't know, just growing up in the outback. By the way, what is the outback? That's a term we hear. It's a steakhouse here in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, which I don't think is really Australian, but I'm not quite sure about that. I actually live in the outback, or what we refer to as the Australian bush. When I was in Victoria, I lived in a metropolitan Melbourne, which was normal, quite close to the city. Where I live now is in New South Wales in a rural or a bush setting. So I've got 36 acres of property, and we don't see another neighbour anywhere near us. The outback is far more removed, and that's where it's right in the middle of Australia, and it's very vast and it's very open.
It's very red too. I'll tell a story. When we installed the cupola, which is this big 7-windowed module, the first day it was installed, we opened up all the window. And we were flying a couple orbits after we installed it. All of a sudden, the whole space station turned red on the inside.
Yeah.
And I remember looking out and seeing the Australia, and I was like, man, it's so red down there. It was amazing. So the outback is not the bush for the American.
No, the bush is where I live now. There's a lot of trees. The outback is more of a desert structure. During times of the season, they have a lot of flowers, but it's not a wooded area. It's more of a flat, open desert area.
I did not know that. The disadvantage of living in the bush is when tractors fall over on top of you. That's
Someone's been talking out of school. Yeah, sometimes skid steers, they do bite. You've got to be very careful and feed them regularly, otherwise they get a bit out of control.
well, I don't think our listeners know, but you had a very close call where you had a tractor incident, and man, that was a close call. Your neighbor finally found you, I guess, right?
Yeah, in short, I got crushed in a skid steer with the bucket crushing me over an hour and a half, and I drove it out of where I was because nobody was coming to my help. Cell phones don't work in our area, so that was useless. And I was able to drive it nearly half a mile to an area where somebody could hear me, and I could take control of my own rescue.
Well, that we're all thankful that you survived that. So, but the real thing I want to jump into here is how Australia has handled guns, and Australia is basically like Texas with an accent, or it's like Texas, only you drive on the left side of the road.
Pretty much.
And so there was an incident in Tasmania in the 90s. Can you kind of walk us through that?
We had a few incidents leading up to that, but probably the critical one you're talking about is in Port Arthur, which is in Tasmania, and it's an island state down south of the main part of Australia. And that was on the 28th and 29th of April in 1996, where we had a 29-year-old offender by the name of Martin Bryant lay siege on a settlement. And this settlement is an old convict settlement. So a couple of 100 years ago, the United Kingdom and indeed yourselves used to get rid of your convicts and sent them down for transport to this area. And it's now a National Trust area, and it's a tourist area. Exactly 2 months prior to that, I was there with my young baby daughter in exactly the same cafeteria or restaurant where this took place.
Oh my gosh.
Now, Martin Bryant had 2 military-style weapons, and he killed a total of 35 people and injured another 23, including himself. So injured 22 other innocent bystanders. And that was really the time when the Prime Minister, which was John Howard at the time, took the lead and decided to reduce the number of firearms in the community and the type of firearms in the community. And leading to that, we'd had a number of other smaller incidences with less numbers. And to keep it in context, Australia has 25.7 million people, whereas the United States has 332 million people plus. So those numbers are the highest we've seen in my history, and certainly what I can research. So that was quite a dramatic situation for us.
And you were a policeman then?
Yeah, absolutely. I joined in 1976.
Oh, wow.
So I was aware of quite a number of the incidents leading up to that, and I can go through those. But that was the one that really changed the landscape for Australia. So what John Howard did, the Prime Minister at the time, he brought in a national buyback scheme, made it illegal to own weapons of certain types, and made us hand them in.
What types?
Well, there's a full list, but basically semi-automatic weapons.
What does that mean? What does semi-automatic mean?
If you pull a trigger once, a bullet will go off. If you keep pulling it, it's semi-automatic. It will keep reloading automatically, and you can load usually 10 rounds. In America, you can load much more. In a military context, you can load 40 rounds in a magazine and keep pulling the trigger. A machine gun.
If you pull the trigger and hold it down, what's that?
That's a machine gun. So that was taken off. Certainly, that was one of the prohibited weapons. Pump action shotguns were made illegal, and I can go through a full list, but there are a whole range of things that would basically, he got rid of the self-loading weapons that were used in military style events. So if you pull a trigger once and hold it and it continues to fire, it's a machine gun. If you keep releasing the trigger and keep pulling it, it's a semi-automatic weapon.
And that could be pistol or rifle.
Yes. We're not a culture here that has pistols. I own pistols because I'm a member of a pistol club and I shoot competitively twice a week, Olympic style shooting. Mm-hmm. But the majority of people don't have pistols, and we don't have laws here that allow concealed carry as you do in America.
So an average person in Australia can't buy a 9mm. 9mm is the kind that the clip goes in, and
that's right.
Yeah.
They can't. And even as a police officer in Victoria, I would carry a 38 caliber revolver. Wow. They've now gone to a semi-automatic weapon like what they'd use in America, being a Glock or a 6 Hour or something like that.
Right.
But we were not allowed to carry that off duty. When I worked undercover, I worked explosives, I worked drugs. That was a different matter. I was given permission to carry it, and I slept with that thing because I dealt with some nasty people. Mm-hmm. But we don't carry off duty.
But the average person, so now at post-Tasmania, is that what do you call that? Is it post-Tasmania? Like in America, we had Columbine.
Yes.
So post-Tasmania, you can't buy semi-automatic rifles. They're completely banned, or you need to go through a process. Or same thing with pistols.
There are exceptions, but the general population can't buy semi-automatic weapons. They can't buy or shorten or modify a firearm. It carries penalties up to 14 years in prison. Mm-hmm. You have to register your firearm. And if you don't register it, that carries a penalty of about, I think it's 5 or 7 years. But it's a very strict process to get one.
The argument here that the right uses the NRA, and in high school debate, we had gun control back in the 80s, and sure. I used all the standard arguments. It takes a good guy with a gun to stop a bad guy with a gun. The criminals aren't following laws, so we need to follow laws. You can't punish law-abiding citizens. All the talking points I had memorized, as a high school English student. But when you talk about, the criminals have the guns anyway. How does that work in Australia? In America, a lot of what you hear from the right is, well, look, Chicago's the most dangerous city in America, and they have the strictest gun laws. Well, they also have Indiana right next to them. So you can literally drive an hour and buy whatever you want with no restrictions. And so how does that work in Australia? You don't have Indiana next door, I don't think.
No, that's true. I think it's worked pretty well here. The system is, if you're an Australian citizen and you wish to have a firearm, say if you wanted to have a pistol is a lot harder. But if you wanted to have a long arm, it could be a 22 caliber, it could be just a normal shotgun, or it could be just a normal rifle. There's a range of those. You have to apply first permission to actually have a firearm license. And that could take 7 months to go through the system. You have to have no domestic violence incidents recorded against you. You're not allowed to have any prior convictions whatsoever. So you can't be a felon. You can't have any of that sort of thing against you. You have to then do a course and have to pass the course and have a psychological profile. You then find the weapon that you want, and you have to then apply for a permit to purchase that weapon. And that could take 3 months. And then you have to have a proper safe bolted to the ground in concrete before you're allowed to take that weapon home. And that is inspected by police. So if you have a pistol, that's worse. That's a far more onerous situation upon you.
Do you have to have like a letter of recommendation saying that you're a trustworthy person?
Yes. Actually, a friend of mine at the pistol club wanted to buy a long arm, just a rifle, to be able to get rid of feral animals. And they needed a statement from somebody to say that they were allowed to come and shoot on my property. And I was able to give that person that authority. Mm-hmm. But it's a fairly onerous situation, and it doesn't remove the fact that people can have firearms, but it's just restricted and controlled in regards to it.
Right. You mentioned the no girlfriend rule, or no domestic violence in America. there was a big battle, and the Republicans prevented the girlfriend protection. So if you're a person who has beaten their wife, then you are not going to be allowed to get a gun. But they they didn't want you to be prevented from getting a gun had you beaten just your girlfriend. It was one of the most onerous rules that I've ever heard of. Anyway, the rules you have make sense to me. And frankly, if I am going to go to the mall or to church or to a restaurant or have my kids go to school, I wish that everybody else here had to abide by those same rules. I think we'd be a lot safer. Do you know what? Well, first of all, but Australia doesn't have a Second Amendment, and so you don't have a tradition. You know, the average Australian probably doesn't feel like owning a gun is what keeps their government in line, and owning a gun is what keeps you free. Whereas that is very much part of the culture here, obviously for a not for everybody, but for a significant number of people.
I understand that. No, we don't have this. And I've actually read your Second Amendment, but growing up, it was very much a rite of passage. When you turned 18, you bought a 22 caliber rifle, which is what people would use in America to shoot squirrels or something small. It's a small weapon. And I bought a shotgun. I didn't really need it, but I bought it. And when the buyback scheme came in, I handed those in, and I was given reasonable money for it.
Right.
And they were melted down, and they got rid of 650,000 weapons. We know definitely that some of those were buried in containers, and they're probably full of water now and rusted. Some people didn't like that and didn't hand them in. And you raised the situation before about criminals. Criminals will always have access to things that the general population don't. Here we find that criminals tend to not use them. They'll carry them for intimidation purposes among themselves, but because if they get caught with them, they're going to do prison time and they'll lose them. So generally they're not being flashed around the street and doing drive-by shootings.
So you didn't have a big problem where all of a sudden the law-abiding citizens were, you know, with unarmed, and the criminals were armed and going around robbing everybody?
No, and it's amazing what we've bought undercover. We've bought things ranging from pen pistols to hand grenades, but the average public would never see those on the street, but they do exist.
Did you do that as an undercover cop?
Yes.
And then like the guy gives you the gun, you give him his $50, and then you flash your badge?
Not quite. Normally you'd step back and you'd put a full brief around them, and someone else would come in and arrest them, and you'd remain unknown.
What's the look on their face? What's the look on their face?
Usually at that stage, they're face down looking at the floor, so you don't really get to see too much about their face. But you do your job and you buy whatever you have to buy, whether it be drugs or guns or explosives, and you move on. So that's amazing.
So those rules sound reasonable to me. That they would never, you couldn't implement them here because of the Second Amendment. That would have to be overturned.
Sure of that. I'm not sure of that. Having read the Second Amendment, it says you have the right to bear arms, but governments always put restrictions. They prevent you from driving too fast. They prevent you from having open containers of alcohol in public in most areas. So why can't they bring a restriction in to say that you have to have a safe, you have to have it registered, you have to have these sort of things?
The Second Amendment begins with the words, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." So the reason they had a Second Amendment was so that we could have a militia, because they didn't want a standing army. They were terrified of standing armies. And we had the Brits walking around in the woods, and we had the French and Indian War. And, you know, the American army was farmers with a musket in the 1700s, but it's not the 1700s anymore. In the 1930s, in 1933, the Supreme Court had a famous case about sawed-off shotguns, because that was back during Prohibition. And the Supreme Court basically said, hey, the Second Amendment is about a militia, and so it clearly doesn't give people the individual right to keep and bear arms. But then a few years ago, the conservative-leaning court came out with a personal individual right to keep arms at home And then just a few months ago, they came out with another one that said you have a personal individual right to carry arms outside of the home. And so what you're saying is true. What the Second Amendment says should easily not be a problem, but how the Supreme Court has interpreted it in the last few years has gone way beyond what it actually says.
Sure.
And so practically from a legal point of view, like New York tried to have a tough process to have concealed carry, and the Supreme Court just shot that down. And so because of our 6-3 ultra right-wing Supreme Court, you really can't have restrictions, unfortunately. And, in theory, you have to get a background check. And the overwhelming majority of Americans want you to have to get a background check. But the NRA and the Republicans have blocked the requiring a background check at gun shows or private sales. So if you just sell your buddy a gun, or if you go to a gun show, you don't have to have a background check. So that has the effect of anybody can get a gun with no background check. So
if you're a felon, or you're a 5-year-old or a psychiatric inmate, you can then buy a weapon.
There's probably there's laws against doing that, but you're not required to do a background check. And so how would the seller know? And then once you buy it, you don't register your gun. We don't register our guns here. And so let's say you buy a gun and then you beat your wife and you get convicted. There's no gun registry where they'll go, hey, I need gun A, B, and C. And so the bottom line are, in states like Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., that it really is harder to get a gun, and they have much lower gun death rates.
Crazy.
But if you really want one, you go to Alabama or Indiana or a state like that. So anyway, I appreciate the rules that you have, but they don't.
It seems crazy. I see this a lot from my law enforcement friends there, whether it be roadside stops or firearms. Here, if a police officer wants to come into the property and check my firearm, they can come in night or day. They don't need any other power. It is registered. My ammunition must be secured in a lock cabinet separate from the firearm. The pistols have to be in what they call a P2 safe, which is a heavier safe than the rifles, and it has to be bolted to the floor it's bolted through the frame of the house.
Wow.
And it's in a concealed room. It must be in that container. I can only remove the gun for cleaning. I take it to the range. I bring it home. I put it back in the safe. I can't just leave it beside the bed.
So if I were going to be a police, let's say my son wants to grow up and be a police officer, I think I would much rather him be a police officer in Australia, where there's not more guns than there are people. In America, every traffic stop could be a fatal shooting. Cops get shot all the time. I'm from Baltimore. A female cop somebody just walked up and shot her in the head, just walking down the street. It's hundreds of times a day, people get shot to death here. It happens, constantly. So since the Tasmania, the new policy, what happened? What did that do to gun statistics? By the way, there's a lot of feedback, Steve. I don't know if you can turn the volume down a little bit, maybe.
You turn the volume down. Let's see how we go. How's that?
Well, let's see. I think so. Let's see.
Okay. How's that? Testing?
I think it's better. I'm turning mine down. We're good. So after the Tasmanian feedback, what happened? What effect did that have after the policy change?
I think it made a lot of difference. As a detective, I was going to, and I still did, I went to a lot of suicides, I went to a lot of shootings, I went to murder scenes and so forth. And that reduced. If you look at the figures since then, our figures now are much lower than what they were. However, in preparation of this, I did a quick Google, and it comes back and it says, I'll quote something I found on Google, and it says one recent study, and it doesn't mention the study, found no evidence that gun buyback programs reduced suicides or homicide where a firearm was involved. One of the things I think we've got to be careful of is of research. Being head of research for a while, I'm aware of people giving you the results that you buy. Now, I don't know where that was actually funded by, but I'd be careful on agreeing with that because I actually disagree with that. I think our buyback scheme did have an impact. People in the country certainly have firearms. I have some of the most venomous snakes here on the property, which now is against the law to shoot or remove. So I'll stand on the fifth that if I've ever removed one. I had a brown snake just outside the door the other day, an eastern brown, which is probably the second most deadly snake in the world, just outside Maribor. So
wow,
that's interesting. A couple of days ago, but I think that the impact certainly has shown that per head of or 100,000 population, our figures are less than 2%, where yours are up around 6 and 7% per 100,000. The other thing we've got to be careful of is that the media will tend to use terminology or figures to suit their own purposes. And so does government and so do law enforcement. So when we talk about mass shootings or mass killings, what's the number we're referring to? You know, Wikipedia says 3 or 4. A recent Australian study from the Australian Institute of Criminology raised that level to 5.
Yeah, that's not apples and apples.
It's not apples and apples, but perception is reality. So if we're not counting the 3 and 4 deaths, we're only counting 5. We have a perception of safety, which is reality. Right. And people think that there's less of a problem. So what are we counting?
Well, I did some research too. One of the several places I saw that you didn't have a mass shooting, like after Tasmania, it stopped, you know. After we had Columbine, we just have more and more and more. I mean, in America, it's just gone crazy. One of the studies I saw said that the suicide rate went down by 80%. I mean, most suicides are guns, not all, but
they certainly in Australia, because the gun culture is different. I've been to many suicides that weren't gun related. The difference between the suicides or attempted suicides I attended with a firearm or where other things were used is quite often, well, firearms final.
Success is pretty high.
Success is pretty high. I got to one when he was still breathing. Unfortunately, he did die later on, but I'd been to quite a number where we were able to save that person's life. But unfortunately, a firearm is final.
Yeah, it is. My neighbor, in fact, a Ukrainian lady who translated several of my podcasts, was killed last month in a murder-suicide by her ex, just a few houses down in this nice, modern, middle-class suburbia, you know. The guy was a gun guy. He was always carrying his pistol around in his pocket. He was just a gun guy. That defined his manhood, and killed himself and killed his ex. And so anyway, it's I have lots and lots of like personal stories with my family where kids were in school issues or anyway, there was a famous one in Colorado maybe 2 years ago in Boulder, Colorado. We were there. We were like, there's a policeman running down the street, and it was the grocery store shooting in Boulder. So these things are very common. And I would imagine in Australia, most people don't know somebody who's been shot to death, I would guess. I don't know.
No, that'd be true. I think it's an own different culture. But on the other side, most members or most civilians don't see crime around them unless they're actually a victim themselves anyway, or it's on the news. And we don't report too much of that anymore because it's not news.
Right. Well, have you gone down the slippery slope? The big, you know, if we get rid of guns, you know, they're coming to take your guns. I was an NRA member because I like to shoot, and I'm a gun owner, and I got my son a 22 and a shotgun when he was old enough. And in the military, I had, you know, I enjoyed it. And I got to a point when Obama was president, I was getting letters from the NRA every week saying, Obama's coming for your guns. Obama's coming for your guns. And it was so ridiculous. I finally quit. I'm like, guys, you're just fanning this ridiculous flame of, you know, worry. It's just not true. But this is one issue in America. I think my European friends, my Asian friends, they just don't understand. Like, why are you guys so crazy with guns? Like, quit killing each other. But it's something very ingrained in the culture. So I'm a big fan of having gun ownership be possible, just have it be limited and controlled. And I think a lot less people would die personally.
Look, I agree with that. I think it works here. I think it'll never be 100% successful. Nothing ever is. But
right.
I'm a gun owner and I enjoy shooting, competitively shooting. At the moment, I'm taking a bit of a hiatus because my blood levels are up with, I've got a bit of lead in the blood, which is I've been shooting inside. But I do enjoy it. And getting older, I used to do martial arts. So I've backed off training in that since the skid steer tried to eat me. So, I certainly enjoy the sport, but there is a lot of emotion in it. And I can understand the emotion, having delivered many death messages in the past. It's not a job that you like to do, but it's part of the job that comes with it.
Yeah.
So regulation and control, registration, I believe is a way to go. And I don't believe there's a barrier that you could do that, having read your Second Amendment.
It's what it's for the same people that were so mad about Roe that, the Supreme Court invented a right that doesn't exist. And for the abortion, they were very upset about that. Well, the Supreme Court just invented a right that the Second Amendment doesn't say. I know I'm going to get in trouble for that, but that's the fact.
Yeah.
And it's part of our politics, which is important. So has Australia gone down the slippery slope? This is what you hear. If we take our guns away, it's just like Nazi Germany. Like I get this a lot. If the Germans had guns, they wouldn't have gone down that slope. Well, that's the stupidest argument I've ever heard. That not Hitler came about because they were humiliated after World War I. They had a terrible economic thing, and they liked Hitler because he promised to make Germany great again.
Sure.
So having more Germans with guns would have only made things worse in the 1930s, right? That's the stupidest argument ever. So has Australian turned into 1984 Orwellian nightmare of authoritarianism and totalitarianism?
No, we're often referred to as a nanny state where there's a lot of control and regulation upon us, even though we're a democracy. But we're a very law-abiding community as a general thing. We don't mind control and regulation, or we certainly comply with it. Let's put it that way. Even the firearms that I own, the caliber is restricted. Civilians can't own a 40 caliber or 45 caliber pistol. They're restricted to lesser calibers, which can still kill.
Yeah.
But,
they could just barely kill you. They won't really kill you. The 38 will just barely kill you.
Barely kill you. But unfortunately, the outcome is still the same.
Right.
But
right.
We don't resist regulation and control. We may grumble about it in our own time over a beer or something like that, but by and large, we follow the rules. Mm-hmm. The other situation here is that I don't know if many people would actually bear down on another human being and pull the trigger if they were in that situation. Saying they would kill another person is different to actually doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, unless you're trained in the military or police or something.
That's training. That kicks in. But for a civilian to pick up a firearm and to actually take another person's life is a big step. And it's something that most people won't do.
Well, that's, the argument is you need more good guys with guns. Well, the data all say that that's the opposite is true. Often the good guy shoots another good guy with a gun, or the cops shoot the good guy with a gun because they think he's the bad guy. That's happened. Yes. Every once in a while it happens. And there was a guy in Indiana a couple of weeks ago in a mall, and somebody started a shooting, and this 20-year-old pulled his gun out and dropped him. Which good. I'm glad he did that. But 90% of the time or more, it's not that happens. And there's a statistic in America that owning a gun, not anything other than the fact that you own at least one firearm, makes you 3 times more likely to die from a firearm. Just owning a gun. And that, like the suicide rate goes up, accidental shootings go up, you might get in a battle. The data just don't support, more good guys with guns. And what we're like for schools, we need the teachers armed. Well, the solution to these school shootings is not to have more school shootouts.
No,
it's to have less school shootings, not more shootouts in schools.
That's one thing we've been lucky here. We don't, as a general rule, have shootings in schools. I do recall one where we had a hostage situation involving early childhood centre with young children, and the offender doused the kids in gasoline and threatened to light them, but he didn't have a firearm. That was resolved quite peacefully, so that was quite good. But I'd been in situations where similar things like that had happened, and I'd given the authority to our equivalent to our SWAT team to go in. So it does happen, but I think we're a long way off that here in this culture, which is good.
Yeah, it's good. It's there have been some really well publicized. Well, Santa Fe was a big famous school shooting, and that's a few miles from my house. My kids played sports there growing up. You know, it's like the neighboring high school. And that was a kid who grabbed his dad's guns, brought him to school, killed his class, lots and lots of his classmates.
It's very immediate, very final. Yeah.
And it's dad has guns. I mean, everybody here has guns. Every house that's within 500 miles of me, you know, there's firearms in the house. And it just takes one teenager. You know, teenagers have bad days. Teenagers have bad days, and
absolutely,
if there's a loaded firearm, that bad day can turn into a lot worse than a bad day. That brings up another thing, Steve. You hear a lot of the on the right, they say, well, we just need more nuclear families. If families would just stay intact, or it's a mental health issue. And when you look at the data, the Center for Disease Control, CDC, ranks gun deaths by state. And states like Alabama have the highest, the 25.5 per 100,000, I think, or something. And states like Massachusetts and other, the 5 highest are Republican states, and the 5 best or least gun violence rates are Democrat states. And so my answer is, does Massachusetts have better family values than Alabama, you know, or might it be the number of might it be the gun policies that do that? But what do you think of the argument? You know, it's about mental health. We need to fix mental health. I've heard and I've read a lot about this, and they say that a lot of times criminals, sometimes they're mentally ill. Sometimes they're just mean or angry or jilted or, you know, evil. Sometimes they're just bad guys.
Sure.
They don't have a mental illness.
That's true. You know, police are fairly black and white in that regard. You're either a decent human being or you're not. And there's a lot of people out there that shouldn't have firearms, quite simply. There's not the right mindset, or they're nasty individuals.
Right.
You can't take that away from that.
But it's not, you know? It's not as though if you went to a psychiatrist, you'd be diagnosed with a schizophrenia or something. You might just be a bad guy, or, you know.
Absolutely. And, you know, you may well not have a history of depression or anxiety or sociopathic tendencies, but you still may have those issues. You may not be recorded as having those. Right. You know, it's the same as saying somebody who hasn't been charged or convicted of a domestic violence incident is not potentially a violent partner.
Until they are, right?
Until they are.
A lot of shooters in America, I think the vast majority, that's their first crime. There's a lot of law-abiding citizens that pull the trigger. You know, and
it's the same as the things here where we talked about Martin Bryant before in Port Arthur. I don't think he had prior convictions. I think he may have even been in the military reserve. That's where he got his training from.
Right. Yeah, it's such an emotional issue, and it's hard to speak rationally about it, because I get gun ownership, and I don't want the government telling me what to do. And, you know, but when people say, well, a lot of times I'll post online and I have thick skin. People say all kinds of bad stuff. That's fine. I say more. It tells everybody about your character when you say that stuff online. But sometimes people say, well, you can say what you're saying because I have my gun defending your rights. And I'm thinking to myself, no, you have the freedom of speech because I was in the military defending your right to have the freedom of speech, not because you have a 9mm in your room. And I know you have an AR-15, but the government has F-15s.
Yes.
Like the government has tanks.
Yes.
So your personal 9mm or whatever hunting rifle is just not going to make a difference. If the government really wants to go down that slippery slope of tyranny, it's going to do that. The way to defend that is to have a strong democracy. Let's strengthen our democracy. Let's have better education, better critical thinking, better voting, freedom of press. Let's have a stronger press. That's the way you prevent tyranny. It's not by arming third grade teachers,
Agreed. And what you raised before about teenagers coming and getting dad's gun. My wife here is not even allowed to have or know where the key to the safe is.
Wow.
I'm the registered gun user. I'm the registered holder of that firearm permit. So my safe has to be locked up, and she is not allowed to know where that key is. She can't have access to it.
Wow.
So it's not like a teenager can just go and open the cupboard up and pick up dad's 9mm. Doesn't happen here.
You don't, in America, you can keep the 9mm loaded in the.
And I've seen it. I've seen that. I've actually been in a place where somebody has showed me he had a 45 Sig Sauer beside the bed, and he opened up the safe and he had an Uzi machine gun and a range of other, an AR-15 and a whole range of other firearms. And it was like, really, this is why do you need a military style weapon in in Southern California?
Well, the Second Amendment is the right to keep and bear arms. And in 1789, that meant a front-loading single-shot musket. With a 50-foot range. After that, it's going more sideways than it is forward.
Yeah.
And even if it hit you, it wouldn't hurt you. It would just bounce off you because it's so unaerodynamic.
Yeah.
But arms, the wording of the Constitution is arms. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So does that mean, can I have an M1 tank? That's arms.
Exactly.
Can I have Javelin missiles? That's an arm. Can I have a B-61, a nuclear bomb? That's an arm.
Can you have something concealed as a belt buckle or as a fountain pen?
Right.
I've actually bought
the James pens, Bond. Right.
I've actually bought those at nightclubs here in Melbourne. They've made a little barrel in them and put a 22 round in them. They're really good in a nightclub. They can drop people on the floor and they're out before the people know what's going on.
Right.
They're made illegally. They are available.
Right. So anyway, the unfortunately, ideology always leads to bad policy. You have to be able to think rationally, and our gun debate has just been kind of. It's really hard to have it. I went to the NRA had a convention here in Houston just days after the Uvalde school shooting. This terrible 18-year-old goes out, buys an AR-15, more than that. A whole squadron of cops were afraid to go in the room. They literally sat there for an hour because they know what an AR-15 can do,
Absolutely.
And the governor of Texas just made it doubled down that now anybody can carry openly anywhere. And 18-year-olds can buy AR-15s, and we slaughter 10-year-olds so that grown men can feel good about themselves because they have their AR-15. It's so perverted.
It seems crazy, but you just raise an issue that if all United States citizens, all Americans can own firearms, why couldn't he buy it at 15 or 10? You've got a restriction there.
Right. I know. And
so why can't you bring other restrictions in?
In 1789, by the time you were 18, you were married half the time,
Sure.
Yeah.
But that's a restriction that we've gone further than that and put in a lot of restrictions.
Right.
And I think that you're not going to take firearms off Americans. You're not going to reduce semi-automatic weapons as we did, but maybe small steps towards achieving that is a way to go. And I would support that.
45,000 a year, Steve. 45,000. If we could drop that by 7%, we would be preventing a 9/11 every year. Imagine if we could cut gun violence by 10%. In other words, if we could still have an absolutely horrendous, worst in the world gun death rate, we could prevent a 9/11 every year.
To save one person is worth it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, to save one person, absolutely is right. And you know what's amazing though? I kind of couldn't believe this. Congress just passed a gun violence bill. They're going to strengthen background checks. They're giving money to states to implement red flag laws. It really did almost nothing. It was very, very, very weak and didn't hardly do anything. But you know what? They passed it, and there were a few provisions in there that will save some lives. That's not going to save thousands of lives, but it will save lives. So it's worth it.
I would support anything to save lives. It's something we need to keep going and keep continuing to do. You won't remove firearms. And even if you do, if you remove firearms, people are still prone to violence. But it'll go in the right direction.
But, you know, hanging yourself is not as easy or quick or effective as shooting yourself. And stabbing someone with a knife makes it really bad for that one guy, but it's not the same as shooting 40 people in 1 minute, right? And so
absolutely. You know, I've been to all of those, unfortunately, but you're right. Instead of 35 or 100 people lives being taken, it's usually the one person, which is extremely sad in itself.
It's terrible, but it's better than, you know, tens of people. I have a police question for you. In America, this became a big controversy we had these racial protests and so on. What do you think about no-knock warrants, no-knock, you know, where the police they don't go, hello, police, you just go in.
That's a level 2 right here. I can speak in relation to Victoria because, like you, we change from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. We have 3 levels of warrants in my jurisdiction. The first one is a level 1, which is a knock on the door. A level 2 is take the door out with a ram or a sledgehammer or whatever you need to do. And a level 3 is where our special operations group is involved, which is your SWAT team. Mm-hmm. And there are certain levels, and they require certain levels of supervisor. A commissioned officer has to be present for a level 3.
Right.
A sergeant must be present for a level 2. And they're usually only things like drug warrants, which was what my field was, where things may be flushed down a toilet, or a person might be armed inside and you need to secure those premises pretty quick. For us, it was our daily bread. We used to probably do 3 warrants a day. As detective, you would probably execute 3 warrants every shift.
Wow. Well, there's a big push in America to outlaw no-knock warrants, or level 2 warrants, as you say. Sure. And my thought on that is that's kind of crazy. And this came about because of Breonna Taylor, who was this poor lady that was shot accidentally in a warrant execution. Her boyfriend / ex-boyfriend was a drug dealer. They arrested him that same day at a crack house down the street, full of drug users and drugs. And, you know, they caught them, and he had gone back and forth to her apartment. They had video of her at the crack house. Her car had been going back and forth. And so the police suspected that, you know, maybe there was something there, and she had a new boyfriend. And so the judge signed off on a no-knock warrant. The police were doing this, trying to clean drugs out of the neighborhood, out of the community. Yeah. Well, when the cops went there, they didn't do that. They actually knocked, and you can hear the banging on the door. Police, let me in. Police, let me in. Well, that woke up the boyfriend, who grabbed the 9mm, and boom, they come running in, and he just starts shooting at the cops. He shot almost killed one of them. I think he shot 2 of them. And then the police shot back and killed her. They searched the premises. There was no drugs. It was a tragedy. I think she was a EMT or something herself. It was terrible, but the nation went in an uproar. We had riots, and they said, you can't do no-knock warrants anymore. Well, the reality is they didn't do a no-knock warrant. They actually knocked on the door, which is had they done a no-knock warrant, nobody in America would even know what had happened. So to me, that seems like the wrong answer, but to me, that's like Germany canceling nuclear power because of Fukushima.
It's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. You know, if intelligence gathering and proper surveillance and proper controls were put into place, they would probably have been able to come up with a situation that was better than that.
I think you're right.
If you have a team that is coordinated and trained properly, know exactly what to do, when and how to do it, everybody's safe. That's the ultimate situation. We would now, rather than go into a property, we would quite often wait for them to come out. But do you grab them before you get into a car? Because once they get into a moving vehicle, that's another weapon that's quite dangerous that they can use. So you've got to make a decision as a supervisor what and how you do it. But I believe there is certainly a a no-knock warrant, as you call it. There is a lot of benefit in that to have as part of your arsenal to be able to use when required.
Well, yeah, if you're going to go into a drug house, would you rather knock where you think the guy might be armed, or would you rather not knock as a police officer?
My first knock would be a sledgehammer going through the door.
Right.
In preference, everybody be face down and secured within less than 30 seconds of entering the property.
Right.
But I'd have probably a blueprint of the house. I would know every room was situated. I would know who was going left, who was going right, who was coming in, and right. I'd have the outside contained as well. So, you know, there's a lot of planning goes into that, and it should be, because it's a dangerous situation you're entering into.
You're putting their life at risk. You're putting their property at risk. You know, I agree. The police need to be very careful. And when they screw it up,
you're putting your own life at risk.
Yeah.
You're putting your own life at risk as well. You know, it's not something that you go into.
He got shot in his femoral artery. He almost bled out. They barely saved him. You know, he's got a life-changing injury because they knocked. And so that's just an interesting thing. Another police question for you. Should you get involved in high-speed car chases? There's kind of a move in America to just stop it, you know, because a lot of times innocent people get killed, and the cost benefit. Yep.
That's an interesting one. I actually headed research and did Victoria Police policy on Victoria Police pursuits. So I know a fair bit about that one. What we do now is that once you can identify, if you can identify a number plate, we call up our communications people, call up a commissioned officer, or at least a senior sergeant, which is one below as an NCO, and they must make a conscious decision, continue, pursue, or abort. And usually if it's a motorcycle, I would come across abort, and stop the pursuit straight away, because we may be chasing somebody for not having a license, and we're doing 100 miles an hour through a city and kill innocent people. It's not worth it.
Right.
So we tend to abort more pursuits than continue. Other states have a pursue it at no cost. They will continue to pursue. In that process, I brought in the things like the road spikes that you use.
Mm-hmm.
And we brought in some techniques that people in the United States use. So we studied what your procedures and policies were, but we are leaning towards not pursuing as much. There are times where we will pursue to a point, but then someone has to make a decision. And I was put in that situation many times. And then it comes on my head. If something goes wrong, I've got to stand up in front of a coroner and justify why I made the decision to allow the pursuit to continue.
Right. I that's a great way to do it. I mean, sometimes it just isn't worth it. Or let the guy go. You'll catch him. Hopefully you've got his license plate and vehicle type, and
then you send a car around and wait for him to come home. Easy, simple.
Right. There's other ways to get him without going, doing the OJ chase down the highway.
So that's an interesting thing too. I see in California, coming there every year, that nightly news has online the pursuit for the day.
Yeah,
you see people who steal cars just to get on television, and it's nightly entertainment. It's just crazy.
Yeah,
we don't allow that. We don't allow our media that close to that anyway. And usually our pursuits are fairly quick. They don't last for hours. We would have called it off before that.
Oh my God. I saw one here in Houston. It's been maybe a couple months. I was driving to the airport and just vroom and cops after it was like a Smokey and the Bandit movie, some Hollywood movie. I'm trying to think, the other big thing in America that we've really struggled with is cops have had unlimited sway. It's impossible to get a conviction on a cop. And I think 99% of our cops are good guys. They deal with the worst of humanity. They do a job that I don't want to do. And my hat's off. They keep you safe when you're injured. And I really appreciate law enforcement, but sometimes they go bad, and those guys need to go to jail or worse. Absolutely. Because, and we've struggled with police accountability. I unfortunately, America just went way to one side, and like police departments are losing 10-20% of the force. The cops who are here don't police anymore. In Houston, it's like the Indianapolis 500. It's like a Formula One race every night, just cars speeding like crazy. Cops don't police here because of all the riots we had. And I wouldn't police either. You pull someone over, you might get shot. And these people are act crazy and they get their phones off and they're filming. And they're like, why are you doing that? And, and then they get $1 million lawsuit. Anyway, the risk to cops has gotten, I think, the pendulum has swung too far in that direction. I don't know if you've had similar experiences in Australia.
I see it more in the United States than here, where people will film somebody and then demand a supervisor and all this sort of stuff, which you don't get here at all. That wouldn't apply. Right. We can also pull you over for a random stop without reason. Basically, we can check the car for whether you've got a license, or we can check to see whether you've got firearms or drugs in the car. Not a problem. We don't need a warrant for that. But it's a different scenario. I think that you've got to have the powers and the ability and training to do the job you need to do, and you need to allow people to do it. It's one of these things that not everyone chooses to do law enforcement, and yes, it can be dangerous. No different to flying an F-16 across enemy territory, I can imagine. But you have the training and the equipment and the experience to do it. So,
yeah. Well, Steve, thank you a lot. This was really interesting. A lot of times I'm talking about galaxies and the universe and, other things, but gun violence is something that's important to me because my family is at risk of getting shot here in America. And it makes me mad and I'm kind of passionate about it. I think we need to make that problem not as big of a problem as it is. So I really appreciate your insight into Australia.
No problems. I hope it works out, and I'm passionate about keeping victims or keeping people safe, regardless whether it's firearms or any other violence. And anything we can do to do that, I think it's a positive step forward. So thank you very much for having me on.
And another thing, your perspective as an Australian, Australia is not necessarily, the flaming liberal capital of the world. It's Australia, you're like us, and we were both kicked out of England. We were kicked out of all the best countries in Europe. And you're a policeman, gun owner, right? So I appreciate the perspective. This is not San Francisco liberal. This is a reasonable human being talking about some ways that we could save lives. So I hope we can implement some of those things here in the States.
Thank you. One other thing that you raised before was about corruption. I was a member of our internal investigations, or our IA, for a little while. And if I said 1% of police were corrupt, that's probably 1% too many. I don't even know if it's that high. I think 99% of law enforcement officers worldwide are there and doing a very good job and are very honest and open. And it's the same as politicians, it's the same as anybody else. There will always be a small group that aren't. Right. I've actually had to charge a police officer and have her dismissed from the force for a criminal act. But thankfully, there's not lots. There are too many, but the percentage is low.
This is probably a cardinal sin. I'm about to promote another podcast. So the BBC has some great podcasts. I really like those. And they had a series called The Lazarus Heist about North Korean and Chinese hackers. It was really good. They have one, I think it's called Bad Cops. It's about the Baltimore police force. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. And oh my God, it's the most unbelievable thing. These cops were just blatantly corrupt. They were literally robbing guys who had been out of jail and they were drug dealers or whatever. They were just robbing them because they couldn't say anything. They're not going to go after the cops because they go back to jail. And like the top detective was leading this ring of Baltimore City police officers. So yeah, it's not 0%. There are at least in America.
Definitely not zero, but it's not 100% either. I think the majority of people are for the right reason, doing the right job.
I respect police a lot, but if you listen to that podcast, you're like, wow, I don't know if you've heard it or not. As a police officer,
I haven't.
You would I'm sure, I don't think you have that problem in Australia. Anyway.
No, I think the corruption level is very low, but it does exist. There's no, I'd be the first person to say that as police, we don't get it right all the time.
Right. Well, Steve, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. And once again, if you like Down to Earth with Terry Virch, please rate the podcast and subscribe.
Thanks very much for having me on.